Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Melbourne Athletic Development Podcast. Today we're extremely lucky to be joined by Professor Gregory Haff. Gregory, thank you so much for joining us. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about who you are and what you do?
So everybody calls me Greg. So I'm Professor Greg Haff. I actually work in the Masters of Exercise Science at ECU in strength and conditioning. I head up the Strength Power Research Group, which is a relatively new research entity within ECU. My career spans almost 25 years now in multiple continents, in multiple universities around the world. As far as my career has gone, I've been in multiple institutions that have different varying degrees of research emphasis versus teaching emphasis. Everything from medical schools to highly teaching, coaching preparation programs. One of the things that I think is important, a part of my career has been this nexus of actual academic inquiry, discussion, but also practical coaching. I think too many academics are stuck in research and just living in the ivory tower and not actually on the coalface with athletes and coaches. And I think that gives me a different context with my research. I think a lot of researchers are becoming somewhat reductionist in the sense that they're getting into the minutia of, for example, biomechanics at the moment is kind of this area where people are just starting to question. We're actually questioning even if it's as valuable as we once thought it was. Yes, small marginal gains are important, but that for the most athletes really isn't the nuts and bolts. It's more about the big rocks that have to get right first before we can consider these minute changes. But so for me, it's always started as a nexus of what helps me as a coach, and then questions that are relevant for a coach. In our research group, one of the things I always tell my students is, if what we do research-wise can't help a coach be a better coach or help an athlete achieve, then we're wasting a significant amount of time. So we always try to be real world and real world aligning. It doesn't mean we don't do harder science or mechanistic work at times, but that mechanistic work has to inform where we want to be as practitioners. So that's been a big part of it. And it's one of the reasons when I was in charge of the Masters of Strength and Conditioning, one of the things I worked very closely with Julian Jones from the AIS is we want all our instructors to be accredited in 2 countries and actively coaching while they're instructing, because it gives authenticity to what they're actually teaching, because they're teaching from a place of application, not just reading a bunch of books and papers and thinking about things in ways that may not actually work in the real world. So for me, that's kind of who I am. That's where I sit. I believe that we should train. I expect my staff to work out and train on a regular basis, hopefully compete in things. And I still do that as well.
Yeah, I love that you say that, and I'm sure you may or may not remember, but both Jack and I have been through that master's course, and it was one of the things that we both loved was the practicality of it. And as the head of that, it was very, very clear that you had that intention all the way through, that it needed to transfer. It was completely pointless, or at least how I read it. It was completely pointless for you teaching something that was not going to make an athlete or a coach better. And I think that made it very, not only approachable, but very interesting to consume the information. So yeah, for those people who have gone down that path, I think, we actually say thank you, because I think it was a really enjoyable process to go through.
Well, and I actually think this leads well into a topic that I want to discuss with you, and that is with periodization, because obviously you have quite a broad knowledge and skill set in that area. You've obviously written a textbook, Periodization, with Tudor Bompa. And I remember one of the things that stood out with your lectures talking about that is the intellectual debate that often goes on about periodization. Like, is it effective? Isn't it effective? And then, of course, we can start to talk about the 1001 different periodization models out there. So yeah, I think a good question to ask is, what is periodization, and is it actually effective?
So one of the things I want to first just kind of frame it by saying, I think a lot of the discussions on periodization within the scientific and coaching literature right now are merely semantical debates where people are saying they don't actually periodize, but they actually do. I actually was very lucky in one way. I got to debate Professor Jeremy Laneke in Spain before COVID, and they had us debating each other about periodization's value, and it was a really interesting discussion. And to make a long story short, basically he admitted that he doesn't train athletes, and to get an athlete better, he was actually suggesting progressive overload. And I was like, well, so you're really suggesting a solution to periodization is a form of loose periodization. You have a plan. So for
Yeah.
me, when I look at periodization, I think of it nowadays on a continuum of loose structure that directs someone's training towards some goal, usually governed by a season, to very controlled structures where we have things like nutrition, we have recovery, we have monitoring embedded, and all those things can be scaled in different degrees of depth depending on what athlete level we're working with. So for me, I think of it as a scaffold to make programming decisions from. So this is really, I think, the important question you have to ask is, why are people conflating periodization with programming? And I would blame sports scientists for that, because a lot of research, you'll go into, PubMed, you'll put in periodization, and you'll see periodization, and it's a 6-week training program. That's not periodization. That's programming, because you're only looking at one attribute, strength training usually. Periodization is more holistic, and it includes multiple facets, and it has to be kind of long term. And so from a definition perspective, I think periodization is a way of planning training where we're going to integrate and potentially sequence training factors to guide the athlete towards some target. And typically, if we look at it from the context of the Olympics, with the exception of the next Olympics, we typically have a 4-year period where we're trying to target some outcome. I, as a coach, for example, if I'm working with a track cyclist, I kind of can guesstimate what a good time is going to be. What time do I need to get on the podium? So I can look at my athlete's development, and I can create benchmarks over, the 4-year plan, where I'm going to try to guide the athlete's physiological performance development over that time period. And that athlete may progress faster or slower, depending on, their physiological responses to training or their how they deal with things outside of training. So for me, it's a structure of planning that we guide the training process. I look at it in 3 levels. I think of it as periodization, which is the macro management of training, planning, where I'm going to choose some sort of model or structure of training, and then programming, where I'm going to design the methods and modes, knowing that the methods and modes are going to be fundamentally a decision tree process. So for example, if I want to build leg strength, obviously the squat in my mind is one of the most superior exercises to do that. But if an athlete's injured and can't squat, what is a regression that I could do that accomplishes the same outcome? What's a progression? What if the squat isn't as effective as I need it to be? I could do accentuated eccentrics and things of that nature. So periodization encompasses planning and programming, and it's this holistic approach of trying to guide the athlete's development towards a goal.
I wanted to ask you, because I kind of agree with you at some levels. Whilst it's interesting, it becomes semantics. The work of people like John Kiley, and what you think about some of the discussions he's brought forward. Probably it started around 2008 or 9. I think he started publishing some papers on this. You're obviously much more well-versed than us. Like, where do you see some of the work like that? Because it's become very philosophical and semantic in nature.
So if we look at John Kiley is actually, believe it or not, he's one of Professor Stone's former students. So he's in the same academic family tree as I am. And talking to Professor Stone, it's an interesting discussion about some of the class debates that they used to have at the University of Edinburgh. And when I look at John's work, right, he's very latched on to Hans Selye's general adaptive syndrome, suggesting that, we can't apply this to sport. However, his argument is that, everyone is not going to respond in the same pattern. Well, I would agree with him on one level. Not everyone responds to a training stress as far as the time course of the resistance phase or recovery from the stimulus. It varies. So, for example, Stoltz-Kameny did a wonderful paper where they looked at the time course of recovery from a resistance training bout in high psychosocial stress versus low psychosocial stress. The pattern actually follows Hans Selye's general adaptive syndrome recovery pattern as a time course of recovery. However, when we're under high psychosocial stress, the time frame is extended. So we're in that resistance phase longer because the stress of that training session is incrementally higher because of the compounding effects of psychosocial stress. So this is where Kylie's like, oh, we can't use Hans Selye. But we're not actually using Hans Selye as a framework for why periodization was developed. And this is a complete, in my opinion, misinterpretation of literature, because we can track periodization back 2,000 years.
Yeah.
We can look at Ficola's work in the early 1930s before Hans Selye even came up with the general adaptive syndrome. We've got Yokelov's work from Russia where he looked at, supercompensation modeling. And so Hans Selye's work is just a way that we can interpret what's going on in the body. And so there's several other time course papers that have come out recently. And I've been looking a lot at the time course of recovery papers. We've been doing some work in that space. And we can see, like, for example, I fatigue you in a training session, your vertical jump parameters, force time curve parameters, have a time course of recovery that follows the general basic pattern of Hans Selye's general adaptive syndrome. So him and Dr. Kiley and Professor Lonneke, they basically are latching on to this Hans Selye thing and saying, we have to throw it out. We can't use it because the original model that Selye used was with toxic chemicals to look at how the body responded to this insult. What they fail to realize, and Professor Stone points this out with his doctoral student, Aaron Kanan, in their paper, that later on in his career, Hans Selye actually did talk about exercise being something that could cause this similar response. Not to the same magnitude as a toxic chemical, but it could actually cause.
We actually spoke with Mark Mattson, and obviously he and Calabrese have done a heap of work in neurobiology and other areas, but just basically across all biological and ecological frameworks, it seems really clear that stress response, and they talk about it from a hormetic or hormesis point of view, seems to carry over. And as you said, it might be extended in its time course, it might be, of greater magnitude or lesser magnitude, but it seems to follow a similar pattern. And I think that there are individual variations, and you can probably speak to the literature on that, because even speaking with people like Derek Everly and his translations of people like Bondarchuk's work, his empirical data looks at, people having slightly different responses, but you kind of end up in a similar place. And I think that you have to come back to that practicality that you said from the start of, are we seeing a general pattern towards a similar thing? And if we are, then whilst we understand that something like Selye is a framework and it's a generalized framework, it is reasonable to apply it in a setting where we're consistently seeing the similar pattern play out. And from a practical coaching point of view, there's no point getting too far into the weeds about it, because there is a level of consistency that is practically useful.
Oh, I would 100% agree. And so what is going to impact that time course of recovery? We'll just call it that for lack of a better term. Well, obviously nutrition. Poor diet will extend that. Lack of sleep will extend it. Injury can extend it. Psychosocial stress can extend it. We actually are doing work at ECU right now. We actually think someone's genetic makeup may impact the time course of recovery to different training stimuli. So myself and Professor Simon Law have been looking over the last few years at, can we come up with basically a polygenetic score that would predict which you recover faster from, high intensity interval training or strength training. And so all of these things, I think, compound. But if you look at the basic shape of the curve, it follows the basic pattern of Hans Selye. Now, I can actually speed that recovery curve by implementing things like cold water immersion, supplementation schemes. I mean, people unethically would use PEDs to actually speed that recovery curve, but the pattern still remains the same. Now, the magnitude of the training stress is going to impact it as well. And this gets us back to things like priming and complexes and things of that nature. If the priming stimulus is too high, we'll overshoot the recovery period to supercompensate at the competition. So those kind of things, I think, are all relative. But one of my favorite quotes is from a sports scientist at the Seattle Seahawks. Patrick Ward always makes this statement, and I really respect it. He says, if we're going to do something new, we've got to rationalize, is it better than what we already do? If it's not, then why are we doing it? And so when I look at these constructs, Kiley's never offered an alternative to periodization, nor has Lonneke. If you actually read Kiley's review paper, his basic conclusion is a form of periodization. He's just changed the term.
Yeah, I happen to agree with you. I think it's just one of those things that it's becoming, too semantic when it comes to, and I think that there's it's not everyone, but I think there is a faction, particularly in the sports preparation, sports performance, and even strength and conditioning world, that is, and look for this is a crude and lack of a good term, but it's just becoming intellectual masturbation. Like, people are trying to show that they're very intelligent, and it's kind of really annoying because at the end of the day, you're trying to get people to run faster, jump higher, lift heavier. Don't get too caught up in some of those things unless you want to go down that academic pathway.
I would agree, but I would also throw another caveat in there. I think a lot of the problems that we have right now, and I'll speak mainly to strength and conditioning, is that we are not reading the historical literature like we used to. So right now, what's one of the hottest trends in Australia? Isometrics. We love isometrics. Yeah. Isometrics are the greatest thing ever. Well, in the 1950s, they spent an inordinate amount of time looking at isometrics. Patrick O'Shea, Bob Hoffman wrote a seminal book for York Barbell on how to train isometrically. And what they find in the 1950s and 60s, it doesn't translate to sports performance in the long term. You can get strength gains at certain angles. And what are we finding now? Similar
Same thing.
I would argue, yeah, exactly. If we look at velocity-based training, it's the answer to everything. A lot of people don't realize that the Russians invented LPTs in the 1970s. And they tried it with their weightlifters, and they found, oh God, yes, we can train with velocity, but they don't get stronger. So they stopped. The Americans tried it. Carl Miller, the national team coach, tried velocity-based training in 1976. His book, he's got a picture of the LPT that he made and how they used it. It didn't work. Can't train solely on velocity. Professor Stone tried it in the early 90s with the V-scope. So did the Germans. All this stuff is cyclical. And so a lot of our intellectual debates are really coming from a framework of not understanding the whole literature. And I blame universities for this, because you would know this from your university studies. They often limit the dates of the research that we're allowed to let students look at by about 10 years. And I think that's a classical problem, because if you go on that notion, then we shouldn't be teaching any of the Newtonian laws. Huxley's sliding filament theory, can't teach it. Gravity, can't teach it, because these are things that are defined. And so when we look at periodization literature, there is a rich history. A lot of the debates right now have been debated before. There's Verkhoshansky and Matveyev were historic for their debates. They hated each other because Verkhoshansky was more about programming, and not these, seasonal kind of things like preparatory, competitive, transition like Matveyev was. And so when we look at that debate, is it that we're just doing things to show how smart we are? Or are we just ignorant to the fact that we don't know what's come before us? Mm-hmm. One of my favorite people, and I really like him as a human being, is Dr. Tim Suchemil. You would think that weightlifting derivatives appeared when he came out the womb. It's his idea. It's not. We were doing it when he was in nappies. And so he's a lovely guy. I love him. He's great. He's a great collaborator, but I've got to always remind him that, Professor Stone was doing this before you. There was people in the 50s and the 70s doing it before you. All we do as scientists is evolve stuff that's come before us. And I think we've got to start to get back to that.
I think it's a really, really relevant point. I coach track, and I always have discussions with people about training methodologies that, as you said, they just go round and round in circles. And people say, "Oh, I'm trying this," and it's like, "Oh, yeah, that was done by such and such at this date." And they go, "Oh, how do you know that?" It's like, well, because I'm a track nerd, and I actually just like the history of training in these events. And I find it very interesting. Even, I think you're right, it probably is an academic thing from the schools and the university structure, but even a lot of the athletes that I coach, they're not even historians of their own event, which I find interesting. I'm like, oh, do you remember this athlete or that athlete? And they're like, I don't know who you're talking about. And I find that a little bit disappointing because I often try and use references from, like, okay, see what this, do you remember how such and such used to do this? I think that's similar to what you're trying to pull off here. If you want to use that methodology, maybe we should look at some of these videos and go through this. And they're like, I don't know who you're talking about. And it's always really interesting when you're like, oh, you kids these days. And I feel like an old man saying stuff like that. And it's silly because I'm
Trying
not
to
that
beat my
old.
age.
Yeah. But it's
Oh,
like you have to respect the history because as they say, you're doomed to repeat the past if you don't respect it.
Well, absolutely, and I think one of the things that's interesting, and I mean, I'll say this wholeheartedly. I was blessed to study with Professor Stone, and he is that is one of the most voracious readers I've ever met in my entire life. And my students often are like, "Oh, Professor Haff, you're making us read too many papers." I'm like, dude, when I was Stone students, each unit had 108 papers we had to read a semester, and we had 3 units a semester with them. That's 300 papers a year at least. And so he was adamant that we had to track things. I remember when I did my thesis under him, a lot of people don't realize that my original work was in glycogen metabolism and carbohydrate supplementation and resistance training. He had me go all the way back to 1936 in the Harvard Physiology lab when the researcher's dog ate some carbohydrates and walked on the treadmill and went farther. And I had to start, that was my starting point for my review of literature for my master's thesis, which ended up being 290 pages long, or something like that, because he was like, you must know everything that's come before. In order to do a better job, you've got to see where other people have either failed or been successful. And so I think that's a big part of where we fall down. And when you are voraciously reading the literature, you start to see where people circularly cite themselves, where they keep like one of the ones right now. If you look at the contemporary literature right now, people believe that the maximal strength is this wildly changing thing from day to day, right? I mean, they talk about this in the velocity-based space. There is literally no citation that actually happens. There is actually no empirical data. Unless you're even in overtraining. Andy Fried in the 90s showed that even in overtraining where they did 10 singles at the 1RM every day, didn't go down. We did a study on sleep.
Can I ask you why, like, what's the mechanism behind? Why don't you think it changes? Is there a good understanding of why it is reasonably well maintained even in an overtraining environment?
So for me, the way I look at it, we look at things as a continuum, right? When we're looking at the overtraining continuum, the first thing that's going to start to happen is mood disturbances. People just start to feel bad. The second thing that's going to go is our rate of force development, because rate of force development is super, super sensitive to fatigue. Once rate of force development goes, then the velocity of movement goes. After that, we're starting to get into strength decrements. Strength is last. Why? Because strength protects us. It protects us from, in combat situations or injury. I have data from the military that shows that strength is maintained even with extreme military training. Relative strength relative to body mass. So I think it's a protective mechanism, and it's about tissue. So we have that tissue and ability to engage that tissue. Now, I know from a study that we did, one of my master's students, Peter Bloomert, did a study way back when, where we looked at 24 hours of sleep deprivation. We maxed the athletes out in weightlifting before, and then they did 24 hours of sleep deprivation, and they lifted exactly the same. They felt horrible doing it. They were miserable as hell. Their technique got sloppy, but they were still strong. And so for me, I think of it as a protective mechanism. Other than that, there really isn't much data, because people have got kind of latched on to this idea that it's wildly variable and that we've got to, look at it. Now, we have a series of studies that we've done at ECU. My colleague and former doctoral student, Dr. Guppy, he did a 3RM deadlift on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And basically
That's
the
brutal.
bandwidth of that, oh, it gets worse. I'll tell you his second study. That was his first study. There's only about a 5%. It's pretty flat. It stays relatively the same. If there is any variance, it's less than 5% in maximum, which is pretty normal. So a lot of people question that work and they're like, oh, it's only a 3RM. So we went and did a 6RM Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. We found the same thing. My former doctoral student, Harry Banyard, we did a 1RM in the back squat, same model. We found the same thing. Vernon is finding the same thing. So what's interesting to me, because if you look at the historic literature of programming, Professor Stone always talks about having a 5% decline, 5 to 10 across the week to account for fatigue. And guess what? It fits right with that bandwidth that we found. So is it really variable? There's another study by Zordos where they max out every single day. They just do a 1RM every day, and it just kind of flatlines and goes up. So is it really that variable? Now, that's one model of looking at it. We're trying to build out other models where we put in other training factors as well, because we could have compounding fatigue impacting strength performance. But in pure strength, it's pretty stable for a short period of time, a microcycle. Now, we don't know about 2 microcycles, 3, 4, whatever, because we know we can maintain strength with one very heavy session a week over 4 weeks can be maintained.
You mentioned rate of force development under fatigue, but the question that, and I know that Jack sent this to you prior to this, but how do you sort of view that spectrum of rate of force development? Obviously, there's discussion about late and early rate of force development and the development of those things. I feel like it's an area that isn't actually, from a literature standpoint, at least upon my reading, isn't discussed enough. How do you see the development of these factors and where they fit into the overall transfer to performance?
So the first thing I'd say is that rate of force development is built on the foundation of strength. So think of strength as the engine, and how we tune the engine is going to make us use it fast or slow. And the great comparison, powerlifter versus weightlifter. A powerlifter's rate of force development is relatively slow. A weightlifter's rate of force development is usually very quick because of the ballistic nature of the training that they do. Often they're pretty comparable strength-wise, especially when you take the powerlifter out of their accoutrements or gear that they typically compete in. Now, when I look at the rate of force development, where it gets tricky is that how you quantify it can dictate its reliability and its validity. The early rate of force development in most situations is highly variable and not reliable, so it's difficult to determine if it's actually a true measurement change or an actual adaptive response for 2 reasons. One, it depends on how the curve is actually analyzed. It depends on where you select your time points. It depends on volitional effort. It depends on fatigue. It's really sensitive. Most of the things that we've done in the bilateral testing of rate of force development are with the mid-thigh pull or isometric squat. And we see that the most reliable time points are about 200 milliseconds, somewhere around there, maybe 100, 150 in that epochs. Now, from my perspective, I think what I am more interested in at the moment is not per se just the rate of force development. We've got into statistical parametric mapping, where we're actually mapping the curve and looking at changes of the whole curve, not just discrete time points, and trying to figure out, is the curve shifting to the left, which would mean, as I'm looking at the screen, which would mean that the rate of force development is increasing, or to the right. Now, when we look at it from that perspective, we can look at the overall trend. The problem that I see in the rate of force development literature is one, a lot of the good work is done unilaterally in leg extensions, and it's done with stim, or it's done, where we actually stimulate and then we measure it, things like that. And we do that against a maximal voluntary contraction. Problem is, with the leg extension model, it doesn't really translate very well to sport. It gives you an overall picture of what's going on in the skeletal muscle, but it loses that dynamic correspondence to actual performance. The mid-thigh pull has always been a tool for us, and we started that in 1993 based on some work by Verboyev from the 1970s. And that rate of force development seems to be quite interesting because it does have some relationship to performance. Now, the problem is, if it's not measured in a standardized way and your protocols are not strict, it can get really sloppy. And so, even in my own work, you can see some of my weightlifters that I've tested and my volleyball players who are very used to doing the Olympic lifts, rate of force development, highly reliable. It looks really good. In non-weightlifters, like military people or netball players in Australia that don't do a lot of weightlifting, it's pretty sloppy and it's hard to interpret it. So we're looking at different ways of interpreting it. So for me, I think you look at both. Right now, I don't really do a lot with the early rate of force development, mainly because of the reliability issues. I'm not sure what it means. And the standard error of it is so high that are we measuring error? And we play with the signal to noise ratio a little bit to try to see if we can make it better, but we're still not where we want to be with that measure. Now, where it may have some use is in the rehab space, is both early and late. So Matt Jordan's work, basically with the drop jump, they look at the rate of force development and they find that after ACL surgery, it can take up over a year for the rate of force development in the surgically repaired leg to actually return. So what we've done is we've started to work, and we're in the process of writing this up now. The isometric mid-thigh pull, we're now doing it bilaterally with each foot on an individual force plate. And we're creating asymmetry indexes, not only for the force production, but the rate of force production, to see if we can preempt a potential injury of the lower limb by looking at the rate of force development in this test that we do with our athletes, and particularly in military now that we've branched into that as well.
Yeah, given that obviously our background, we obviously work as physios as well. So it's something that, based off Matt's work, it's one of the things we often look at with some of the equipment that we have here. And I'm not going to lie, I'm sure there is a lot of measurement area, but it is very, very obvious that there's significant asymmetry that you see in that rate of force development in, say, post-ACL athletes. And it's even, funnily enough, I had a track coach bring an athlete along not too long ago who's gone back into track, but he's coming off an AFL injury of rupturing his ACL. And he was asking me about technical changes for the track. And I said, well, let's actually have a look at his rate of force development in a drop jump for his ACL, injured side. And the asymmetry was enormous. And I said, let's fix this first. Let's not worry so much about his running technique, because I think it'll actually tidy itself up once he improves some of his strength profile and his power profile, and his rate of force development will get better. And that will actually sort a lot of those things out. Further to that, and it's something that I've been playing with, and I haven't actually looked a lot at the research on this, but I'm noticing a similar pattern with muscle strain type injuries, where the strength tends to come back quite quickly, say like post a hamstring strain, the symmetry difference becomes negligible, but the rate of force development, particularly at longer lever lengths, seems to be maintained for longer. And it's something that I don't know if you actually, do you know, is there any data that you've seen on things for muscle strain injuries about rate of force development, or is not that research not necessarily out there? Because one of the things I've been setting as a guide for people is, a multiple of their maximal force output in terms of their rate of force development as a target. Because I noticed that typically if people were not hitting those rate of force development numbers, they seem to be very likely to have these re-injury sort of things going on with strains. And, I'm working literally off the limited data that I've got, but I thought you may know of actually some people looking into that kind of stuff.
So I don't know anybody who's looking into like hamstring injuries and rate of force development, but then I would say that I haven't really spent a lot of time in that space. I can tell you that what we have seen and we've been doing a lot of work with the military, and we look at large cohorts of military soldiers and our personnel, and we find that we can actually look at the tracing and go, you've had a left leg injury.
Yeah.
And usually we're looking at either the differential between the peak force between the two limbs, but also the slope of the curve. And inevitably we are able to find if someone has picked up an injury or has an injury, or often what we've been trying to do, and we haven't gotten the cohort of information together, is do a pre-screening and then track them to see if someone who has this profile actually gets an injury. I would argue that it's probably a combination of both rate of force development and the peak force. But yes, I would say that makes sense to me. I would argue that we've seen that as well in our applied data. We just haven't published it because we don't have enough subjects to actually do a study that's powered enough. So as a practitioner, I'm like, all right, I'm
do,
still
so that I'm not just talking out of my ass when I say these things to people.
Well, it's just about getting, the biggest challenge that we have is this. This is something that Professor Stone and I talk about a lot, actually. And I'm glad that, he's in his 80s now, and it's fun to really still chat with him about things. Is that in the real world of sport, we might have to say, okay, the data is not completely there yet, but the data is trending this way. Let's just go with it. It's not going to do any more damage, but it's going to actually help us. And so for me, then I will actually kind of say, all right, we're going to still look at this. I know Dr. Guppy and I, my former student, we disagree sometimes on, certain things. He doesn't like to measure the rate of force development. He's more in the impulse camp. And I'm like, okay, I love impulse, but I still think rate of force development has its place. And so I would still measure it. And so, and he will as well, but we often have philosophical debates on it. And so what I would suggest is that if that's something that you have found there's power in your practice, to keep it. And then eventually, hopefully, the science will catch up a little bit.
Speaking of rate of force development, you're talking about different ways of measuring it. Two methods you mentioned is isometric mid-thigh pull versus, say, a drop jump. They are obviously quite different in terms of the physical requirements. But one question I have for you is, when you think about that correlation between strength and rate of force development, is that consistent when you think about an individual's ability to perform a drop jump, where something like contact time being really short is such a valuable and important measure for, say, improving something like reactive strength index? Or do you think that's a fundamentally different element to, say, that power spectrum that does require unique training?
So the drop jump is actually highly technical, and a lot of people don't realize that. There's a technique to it. And John McMahon, who used to work for Salford University, now is working for Hawking Dynamics. He's done some really nice work on the vertical jump and looking at the landing from a vertical jump. So you jump as high as you can and then measure the landing. And he's actually saying that that might be a better test than the drop jump, because it's not as technical and you do it all in one test. You don't have to add another test. So you do a vertical jump, up, land. Now, there is technique to the drop jump. The drop jump, if you're looking at the contact time, obviously it's related to the eccentric strength and the stretch shortening cycle. So if I'm not strong enough to offset the eccentric load of my body being accelerated to the ground, that contact time will be longer. Okay. And then we're going to basically not have as high a jump. Now, someone who's very reactive will have a shorter contact time. They often have the strength to offset that eccentric load. Basically, the way I look at it from a practical perspective is they have the strength to turn direction. Like they have enough force to produce quickly that they can actually stop and change direction. So for me, I think it's very technical. And sometimes with the drop jump, because of its technicality, and often people do it wrong, they either step down when they jump or they jump off and jump, which can cause problems. I think that impacts the measure a little bit. So I would argue that these are different strength characteristics along that strength force velocity continuum potentially. And it has to do with the different engagement with the stretch shortening cycle, in my opinion. For example, a mid-thigh pull is just purely force production, and we can get a rate of force development from that isometric contraction. With a drop jump, there's things that are going to impact that rate of force development. Are you able to engage the stretch shortening cycle rapidly? Are you strong enough to offset that eccentric load of being accelerated into the ground? The other method, as John McMahon would suggest, would be your reactive strength index, where you jump, and then you land, and then you measure the landing. So all of them, I think, are different actual assessments that give you a holistic picture of your athlete's perspective. And I think if I was going to narrow it down to just two, I would always do a mid-thigh pull and I would always do a vertical jump, because those give me a lot of my information. And if I can measure the landing, then I can get that drop jump as well. Now, your question is specifically about the rate of force development. The problem with the rate of force development in the vertical jump is it lacks reliability. Most people don't like to measure it. Now, that being said, Professor Andy Fry at the University of Kansas, he does measure the eccentric rate of force development in the vertical jump, because there is some data which SpartaTrack is based upon that suggests that might be indicative of injury risk and performance monitoring. My problem with it is it's not always at the reliability standards that we want. And one of the things that I'm always concerned about is, are we measuring noise? Or are we actually measuring change? And a lot of times in a lot of these devices that we have, we're measuring noise. And are we making decisions that are not correct because we're not actually getting usable data? Most of your velocity measurement devices fall into that category, your accelerometers, your IMUs, etc.
Yeah, so there's a potential issue here where I think there's a lot more commercial products available that even we use, where people are making certain assumptions based on very little or no data about, I guess, one, like you're saying, the reliability of the actual assessment itself, but then actually what that actually tells us too, in terms of, does that give us a good indication of, say, early RFD or their elastic function, and do we see actual changes over time, or is that just related to standard error measurement?
Absolutely. So like if you're familiar with like the Beast velocity meter, a lot of people will use like velocity bands. If you change by 0.05 meters per second, you've gotten stronger, yada, yada, yada. However, the Beast has an error rate of 0.6 to 1.1. So if you're using that for training, you're not actually measuring change, you're just measuring noise. But if I put that device on a machine that's guided, it might be reliable. But the problem is, it's a system. It's the human and the velocity meter that have to work together. And people argue, oh, it's biological variability. Okay, if it's biological variability, why is strength not changing? So that's a question. And I think any device that you get, and I think this is really important, and it's related to rate of force development, it's related to power, it's related to testing, and in a lot of ways it's related to periodization as well. Any device or system that you're going to apply, you've got to ensure that it's reliable and it's valid. Because if it's not, then your assumptions can be made in the wrong direction. You might actually think your athlete is tracking one way when in fact they're tracking another way. And so I am very, in our lab, we spend an inordinate amount of time testing devices and trying to find tools that are going to be effective. And a lot of people get on my case about velocity-based training because they're like, oh, he's anti-velocity-based training. I actually want velocity-based training to work. As a theoretical construct, it's awesome. But the devices are not reliable enough to actually work the way people want them to. They have a place in our strength conditioning practice, but it can't be our only tool in the toolbox. You know, the old saying, if all you have is a hammer, everything's a nail. And I worry about that because there are some people in Australia now that are foregoing periodization and just going on velocity for their training and saying, we're just going to do 10% velocity loss. It doesn't matter how many reps we're going to do, as long as just 10%. But if I do sets of 20, because if you look at Jonathan Weekly's work, a 10% velocity loss could be as little as 4 reps or as many as like 15.
Yeah.
Well, the physiological strain of 15 reps bioenergetically is very different than 4. Those are 2 different fatigue profiles. And do I really want to do sets of 15 in season?
No, probably not. Changing tack just a touch, but I'd love to get your idea on this because not many people have been able to kind of, I think, provide a strong answer for this. But you alluded to it, and I don't know if this is what you were talking about when you mentioned biomechanics right at the start. But we were talking earlier about, what transfers from the development of physical characteristics. And I'm always having debates with biomechanists of, how much do the underlying physical capacities influence what we see, kinematically? And it's an interesting discussion. So I'd love to get your idea on, is what we see as biomechanical outputs, more related to the underlying physical characteristics, or is it, more of the skill component? Because I feel like I agree with you, even as someone who straddles both sides of the coaching and even the physical performance realm at times. You can easily fit into one or either camp.
I think it's a really interesting discussion point. It's one that we have some spirited debates on here at ECU, as you would probably suspect, because I have watched some of your other podcasts with some of my colleagues. When I look at it, first I'll frame it this way. As part of my training, I am actually also a biomechanist. I started out as a biomechanics person and shifted from to the dark side and went to physiology. because a lot of people don't realize that Professor Stone actually has a dual doctorate in physiology and biomechanics. So he makes all of his students study both and become masters of both. So I actually did, video analysis with 2D Modis and all that stuff for many years, and did biomechanics and actually taught postgrad biomechanics at Appalachian State. So I have a pretty good background in biomechanics. But I would start with the framework that physiology underpins biomechanics. It has to. Why? Because the physiology is the system that actually creates the force. Now, obviously, angle of insertion and things like that are going to dictate, some of these parameters. But fundamentally, muscle contracts, and it's driven by physiology. Now, how that muscle adapts can be, we can discuss, different, bodybuilding constructs of angles and things like that. You build hypertrophy at longer muscle lengths and things like that. Now, a good example of what I mean by that, the underlying capacity is physiological. If you look at, for example, a technique, a great example is the iron cross in gymnastics. If you look at that as a technique, right? Yes, there is a technical component to it, but if you don't have the physical capacity to apply force at a requisite level, you cannot do said technique. So it is strength underpinning the technical proficiency. And so I don't actually think you can separate the two. You have to have strength in order to do certain techniques. So that's why if we look at athletes as a progression, different level athletes, their technique will emerge over time and adapt to their physiological capacities. I use a great example in my classes of one of my former athletes that my wife coached. Her name is Sammy, and she was a discus thrower who couldn't hold the discus parallel to the ground. Well, how is she going to get the discus into the right position to get the right release trajectory if she can't physically put the technique into the technique? And that's an example, again, that once we got her strong, she was fine. She could evolve her technique. So with technique, obviously we have biomechanical models, and I think we need biomechanical models of what efficient technique is. But that doesn't mean you force people into a specific technique, because there is inter-individual differences. A great example is the Flounsbury flop in athletics, right? Before that, they did the straddle. That was a technique. But he found that this technique was more effective for him, and then ultimately biomechanically it became a more efficient technique. So I think you're looking at it from that perspective, is that the capacities you build have to underpin what you're trying to translate to, and then technique can be developed and fine-tuned mechanically. And that's where videography and analysis comes in. The problem that we get into in biomechanics, especially with 3D motion analysis, is the processing time is so long that by the time you process it and give feedback back to the athlete, they have probably changed their technique slightly. And we see that in weightlifting a lot. Now, one of the things I also look at from a biomechanical perspective is kind of this bandwidth of acceptability. And I think this is an area that we debate a lot about here at ECU, especially with the isometric mid-thigh. We probably shouldn't have called it the isometric mid-thigh pull, because everybody's got it in their brain. They got to measure the femur and put it at a halfway point. Anatomically, it doesn't work that way, because if I have like little T-Rex arms, it's not going to be at my mid-thigh. If I've got I got a weightlifter who's an ex-gymnast. When he has his hands next to his sides, they're at his knees. So you have to kind of look at things practically as well. My friend, you probably know him from his 200 and 400 meter running, Michael Johnson. I had the great pleasure of spending time in China with Michael Johnson, and I think I can call him a friend. His running technique was horrible from a pure biomechanical perspective from the waist up, right? Would you agree? Straight up and down. Exactly. And every biomechanist in America wanted to change it, and they tried, and he got worse. And then they said, screw this, let's just work on his running capacity. I think he was pretty successful. He set, gold medal performances and world records. And when I talked to Michael, and one of the conversations that we had, I said, what was the most important thing for running fast? And he told me, being as freaking strong as possible. And that really cemented to me, here's a guy that runs really fast, Being strong underpins it. And then talking to Dietmar Schmidt-Bleicher, who is one of my research heroes, I think him and K.O. Hakkinen, my trifecta, like the three horsemen of the apocalypse, are Mike Stone, Dietmar Schmidt-Bleicher, and K.O. Hakkinen. You get the three of them in a room and you are in for a learning experience. There's more knowledge in the three of them than probably the rest of us put together. The one commonality that they all agree on is that strength underpins everything. Biomechanically, performance-wise, everything. And they're all from different places. Dietmar's German, KO's Finnish, Stone's from America. And they have limited interaction with each other at times over the last 50 years. So from my perspective, I think, yes, there is a technique model that we're trying to get to. Physical capacities underpin our capacity to get close to what a perfect technical model is, but there's high variability in technique between individuals because of their different anatomical structures, their different injury profiles, their different technical models that they might ascribe to. Now, one of the things that we get into serial debates is that a lot of our staff here in our biomechanics division think it's all about technique. But if you don't have the physiological capacities to underpin the technique you're going to try to attain, I don't think you can attain it. And so it comes back to what Verkhoshansky calls the principle of dynamic correspondence. What we train must have translation into capacity-wise into what we're trying to get. Regions of force production are quite important in those models. So you can't think of things in a reductionist way. I can't just say, oh, the ankle is the only thing that matters, because the ankle isn't the only thing in the system. It's a kinetic chain. It's multiple things interacting together. It's not just one thing. Now, rehabilitation, yes, I would have to work on rehabbing an injury, let's say an ankle injury. I've got to do something about it. But from a training perspective, I'm not so sure I would agree with people that get that reductionist.
No, I tend to agree with you. Even from a coaching perspective, I like to allow people to explore the movements using the physical capacities they've got. I really, and I think this is something that actually I probably picked up from you with some of the development, when we do our practical sessions on weightlifting, of allowing people actually to practice the movement, even if there are some errors. And obviously you mentioned you've got to have a bandwidth in which is acceptable. You don't want someone swinging a bar, far away from their body and all sorts of things, but you would need to allow them to explore it enough and use the physical tools that they have to work out whether they can then use that technique based on those underlying capacities. And if they don't have the capacities, they're probably not going to get there anyway. So no, I appreciate you actually putting that into context for people.
A question I have for you, Greg, is you mentioned before about changes in things like mood, rate of force development in response to fatigue, but strength maintaining being pretty consistent. What about the relationship between the biomechanics and how that changes over time? Do you expect to see large variations in biomechanics as well, and that actually has to be something that you accept as a part of the normal variability of movement?
So this is actually a really good question, because if you think about it, one of the great ways you can look at this, one of our graduates, I don't know if he was in your practicum or not, but Padraig Roach from Arsenal, he's their development coach, and he shows wonderful data on peak height velocity and post peak height velocity. So anytime your body changes, you've got to go back and relearn technique. So you've always got to go back to those basics. So I would make the argument, not solely based on what he's shown with Arsenal and the work of Rodri Lloyd from Cardiff Met, I would make the argument that when you change strength, you get stronger. It changes your technique slightly. So you're always having some element of technique training in your development as your capacities are going. One of the things I'll use as an example, and I think this is a really good one. A lot of people give me a hard time because I truly believe that double bodyweight squatting is kind of this necessity for high level performance. And I know I get raked over the coals in social media all the time as some sort of lunatic because of this. But the reality is, when I work with athletes and I coach, I know that once an athlete can squat double body weight, it's like the door opens to many different things that they can now tolerate and they can now do. One of our former graduates, Holly Shawcross, who is one of my weightlifters, and she was very skeptical when she was a student of this double body weight thing. She believed the lectures and she listened, but once she crossed the line, I remember one day in training, she turned to me and she goes, I get it now. because she felt the difference in certain things that she was doing from having this strength reserve, this capacity. So one of the things I think is that when we start to look at this idea of increasing strength, it's going to allow us to do different technical things, more advanced technical things. A good example, if you look at Chinese weightlifters, they often start with their hips very low at the start of an Olympic lift. So everybody tries to model it. But if you talk to the Chinese coaches, which I have, because I've actually coached a little bit in China as a visiting coach, they tell me, oh no, we don't do that until they can squat 2.5 times to 3 times body weight. Because they're not strong enough to maximize the effectiveness of that technique when they're below 2 times body weight. So I would argue that, yes, technique is going to have a bandwidth of change, that we have to keep it in our technical model. And as we change physical capacities, we're going to have to retouch that technical skill constantly. And every time we come back to technique, we have to relearn it. Professor Stone teaches it as the depletion-repletion method, where you take a training activity out of training for a while, and when you bring it back, you gain performance very quickly as you relearn that activity. And in some ways, you could think of periodization and training as deliberate practice. And in fact, Newell actually recently came out with a paper that suggests that resistance training is actually motor learning. So in a way, resistance training is deliberate practice of motor learning. And as we become more stronger, the skills that we can learn become more complex or more efficient.
Yeah, that makes sense. Does that in any way relate to, and I'm not well versed in this, so it'd be interesting to hear your opinion, but the discussion around coordination that Franz Bosch talks about?
With Franz Bosch's stuff, a lot of that stuff is interesting, and I'm going to use that as a blanket term, but it lacks dynamic corresponding. But it lacks dynamic correspondence to actual physical activity, because the force zones that he's developing don't relate to the sports that he's training. Like, for example, some of the exercises and drills that he's making people do, where the force is applied is not the same as where the force is applied in the sprinting motion, for example. And so I'm really skeptical of some of Franz Bosch's exercises. There are some that are classic track and field exercises. But there's some that you're like, a power clean into a step up. Why? Most people don't do a power clean well to begin with. So let's make it more complex. I'm more, as I've gotten older, simple is better. Do a few things really, really well than a lot of things really, really bad. And try to get dynamic correspondence. I really, truly believe the principle of dynamic correspondence is one of the most important principles in strength and conditioning. In fact, over the last 5 years, it's become a big part of our training program design unit because of feedback from the institute system that people are just randomly creating weird exercises that really don't translate to performance very well.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with that. I think it's become a fad for people to invent their own exercises, and most of the time they're probably exercises that have been done. They just haven't seen them before, as we spoke about historically. We nearly touched on an hour, so we won't hold you up too much longer. But a question that we always like to ask guests that we have on is, what's something that you're exploring that doesn't really have to be related to your profession, but it's keeping your interest and it's intriguing you, and we always find curious people like yourself are always learning something. So is there anything that you're interested in and you're exploring that at the moment you're happy to share with us?
Yeah, I mean, I probably have. I'm probably one of these people that I probably do too many things as far as I have many interests. And at the moment, outside of work, I have probably about 2 or 3 that I've really spent a lot of time. One, I'm actually fascinated in what makes someone successful, mastery. I'm a real big fan of Michael Gervais' podcast, Finding Mastery. And I find myself reading a lot of books on mastery, like things about like really super successful people and about how they became successful and what are the commonalities, what makes, Michael Jordan one of the greatest basketball players of all time.
Can you share some insights from that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that is really interesting as I read a lot of these books, they all have some commonalities. They have a framework that they work from of, you know, without getting too philosophical, they know what they stand for and know where they're trying to get to. And they have a framework of, you know, hard work as a foundation. And it's not always the search for attention. It's a search for improvement, like a growth mindset. And I find that really, really interesting. I find a lot of people that I interact with are really more interested in, you know, what does it get me, not actually the journey. And most of the really, truly great people that I've had the opportunity to interact with, almost all of them have the same basic underpinning thing. They just want to be the best they can be. And how do I get there? And they thrive on the journey more than the end product. And I find that fascinating. And so I tend to read a lot in that space. I'm also reading a lot at the moment in leadership. I'm fascinated by leadership, especially within the military construct. So I'm a voracious reader, actually. You know, books like, one of my favorite ones I've read recently is Admiral McRaven's Wisdom of the Bullfrog, which was a really great book. It wasn't a hard read. It was a good read that about leadership principles and how to get a high performance organization to perform at a high level. And his was from when he was the Bullfrog. So the Bullfrog is the highest Navy SEAL in the Navy SEAL higher structure. They call him the Bullfrog. And so he was sharing lessons he learned from leading special forces operations. And I found that really fascinating. And I find those lessons of high performance actually translate to sports performance as well.
Oh,
So that's
massively.
the second thing I read a lot. And then, massively amount of things I read in that space. My wife really gets frustrated when Amazon comes, because they come quite frequently to our house, because I tend to buy a lot of books, which means whenever we move, we have to pack all these books. It's getting quite large, actually. And I think looking at the reading structure, and a lot of people ask me why I like to read so much. And one of the reasons I tell people is I have dyslexia, and that one of the things that my parents made me do when I was young was read to practice the skill of reading so that I could be more effective and not use dyslexia as an excuse. And so I've always been a big reader, but also my dad's a Marine, and there's a Marine Corps Commandant reading list. So one of the things about the U.S. Marine Corps is they have a reading list for every level of the Corps. And each year they have to read different things. So that reading list has become a big part of my life as I've, become older and look for guidance and things. I often go to the Marine Corps Commandant's reading list. So I spend a lot of time there. And the third thing I'm fascinated with is I like making pizza. And so I'm
Don't we all love
fascinated
pizza?
with how to make. Yeah, and the older you get, the less you can eat of it. But yeah, I'm fascinated with pizza making. I often think about days when academia has got me down. Like, I just want to go in a pizza shop. People are much happier coming to a pizza shop than they are to academia. But yeah, those are the three things I probably think about the most. And yeah.
Thank you so much, Greg. We really do appreciate someone of your particular academic stature, but just generally, your level of knowledge, being willing to take time out of their day to come and chat with us. So thank you very much. We really do appreciate it. And also, personally, I hope Jack agrees with me, but thank you actually for what you did with the course at ECU. It was foundationally for both of us professionally. It's been a huge influence and a very positive one at that. So personally from us, thank you.
Absolutely. I was going to say, I think one of the things that I really valued about the course, but even today's discussion, is the importance of not to get caught up in the hype or the narrative of whatever goes on, because the reality is, as you've articulated very well, so much of what gets blown up on social media is just rehashing history and following whatever's trending at that point in time. It's so important, I think, with just learning in general, but particularly with regards to strength and conditioning, or what we like rehab for us, of not moving away from fundamentals. And I think that's something that a lot of people forget, and it doesn't seem sexy to talk about such things as basic principles, but it's so valuable and important.
But I think that it ties back to even like the reading that I was talking about with finding mastery and leadership and all that stuff. It's finding what you stand for and what you believe in, what's your bedrock, and where do you hang your hat. And And I really think the Navy SEALs really say it well. We fall to the level of our preparation, not rise to the occasion. And I think what we have to do is really stay true to the foundational components and then build out from there. If the foundation's not right, it doesn't matter how many rooms you add on. It's not going to be a great place. But I also think there has to be humility and the ability to question oneself and admit when you haven't gotten something exactly right as far as training. One thing I've learned over the years is that coaching is a scientific lab. We will make mistakes, and they're never with intent, but things don't always go the way we hope they would go. Sometimes they go well despite what we've done. And so I think that humility approach is important. But I do appreciate the kind words about what we do. It's never been about fame or anything like that. It's always been about just a passion for what we do as far as strength training and trying to find answers, to be honest, more for my own capacities than anybody else. I still haven't achieved what I want to achieve physically, and it's just getting harder as I get older. But I do appreciate that greatly. But I would say that I do have a new book coming out this year. It's
Fantastic.
out in April. It's my first solo venture on periodization. And a lot of concepts are in there. I actually start to branch into the potential for big data science, and AI as a foundation underpinning periodization as well, which is going to be, I think, the future.
Well, to our listeners, I'm sure many of them are interested in that. Definitely buy Greg's book when it comes out next year, because he is an expert and he's someone definitely worth listening to, particularly in that space. Greg, thank you so much. We do very much appreciate everything you've done. Thank you.
You're welcome. Have a Merry Christmas.
You too, mate.